Isaiah was a great prophet in the Old Testament. His words are still relevant today. The temple is the center of religious life. In the midst of this scene, a man arises with a message that will shake the nation. This man is Isaiah. His prophecies are not just about the future. They are about the heart of God. The book of Isaiah is like a road map of destiny. It is a text that challenges our understanding. It mixes dark warnings with radiant promises of hope. Isaiah revealed the cosmic drama that would unfold in the centuries to come. He was not a distant man lost in heavenly visions. He was engaged with his people and his time. He saw corruption, social injustice, and religious hypocrisy. He did not remain silent. His words were like thunder, warning of divine judgment if the people did not repent. The first lesson we can learn from Isaiah is the importance of having the courage to speak the truth. The truth is hard to speak, even when it is needed. We often stay silent because we are afraid of conflict. Isaiah says that the truth is the path to redemption. His prophecies are not just about judgment. No, they are a beacon of hope. Isaiah speaks of a future where wolves and lambs will live in peace, where swords will be turned into plowshares. Does it sound utopian? Perhaps. But what if these visions are an invitation to dream of a better world? Isaiah's book intertwines the present, near future, and distant future. He speaks of kings and kingdoms of his time, a Messiah who would come centuries later, and an eternal kingdom that is still to come. What would it be like to have this panoramic view of history? How would it change our perspective on the challenges of Isaiah taught us to see beyond our immediate circumstances and trust in a greater plan? Many call Isaiah's messianic prophecies the fifth gospel. Isaiah speaks of a suffering servant, a king born of a virgin, and a ruler who will bring everlasting peace. Christians believe these prophecies were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Even if you are not a Christian, these prophecies are intriguing. They make us question if there is a greater purpose for human history. What makes the book of Isaiah so captivating is that it is not just a religious text. Isaiah's language is rich in metaphors and vivid imagery. He speaks of mountains melting like wax and of deserts blooming like roses. It is poetry in its highest form. We can also learn from Isaiah the importance of language and communication. How can we share messages that truly touch people? We need to use poetic language and metaphors that spark the imagination. Isaiah was not just a dreamy poet. His prophecies are anchored in the reality of his time. He names kings, speaks of political alliances, and comments on the economic situation. Authentic spirituality engages us with the world. This leads us to a crucial question: how? Isaiah shows us that we can balance our spiritual vision with our involvement in the world. Isaiah's divine calling is a pivotal event in the history of biblical prophecy. This landmark moment in the prophet's life occurred in the Temple of Jerusalem, a place of great religious significance for the people of Israel. Isaiah's experience described in chapter 6 of his book is a powerful narrative that illustrates the encounter between the divine, and in the year of King Uzziah's death, Isaiah had a vision. He saw the Lord sitting on a high throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. This shows the greatness and majesty of God. It happened at a time of political transition. This shows how prophetic calling often coincides with periods of change and uncertainty. Isaiah describes the scene with many details. He mentions seraphim, celestial beings who flew. Each had 6 wings. With 2, they covered their faces. With 2, they covered their feet. With 2, they flew. This image shows that the seraphim were in awe of the divine presence. They proclaimed, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord." Isaiah saw God's glory and felt inadequate. He said, "Woe to me! I am ruined." Isaiah says, my lips are unclean. I have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. This shows that prophets often feel unworthy before God. Then, a seraphim touches Isaiah's lips with a live coal from the altar. The seraph says, "Your lips are pure. Your guilt is gone. Your sin is forgiven." Purification and preparation for prophetic service. After this purification, Isaiah hears the Lord ask, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" Isaiah responds immediately and decisively, "Here I am. Send me." This shows that Isaiah is willing to accept the divine call even without knowing what it will entail. Isaiah's calling is not easy. The Lord sends him to deliver a difficult message to the people. He must warn them about the consequences of their disobedience, and lack of Isaiah must deliver a challenging message to the people. They will not understand or accept it. This is a common challenge in prophetic ministry. Isaiah's calling is to deliver unpopular messages and face resistance. It is important to understand the historical context of Israel at that time. The kingdom was divided, with Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Both kingdoms faced threats from foreign powers and struggled. Isaiah's calling arose in a complex scenario of corruption and social injustice. His ministry lasted several decades and spanned the reigns of various kings of Judah. He faced significant challenges, including resistance to his message and threats to his personal safety. However, he remained faithful to his calling, demonstrating remarkable courage. Isaiah's experience of calling raises important questions about vocation and purpose. How do we recognize our own calling in life? What kind of preparation is necessary to fulfill our mission? Isaiah's response, "Here I am," is a model of availability and obedience that has inspired many. Isaiah's calling also illustrates the importance of authenticity in spiritual leadership. Before he could speak to others, Isaiah had to confront his own imperfection and experience divine grace. This process of anyone aspiring to a position of spiritual influence must examine and purify themselves. Isaiah's calling shows how personal experience with the divine can transform you. The vision in the temple redefined Isaiah's identity and purpose. He entered the temple as an ordinary man and left as a prophet. As a prophet of God, Isaiah's experience influenced his message. Themes such as the holiness of God, the need for purification, and the importance of obedience are in his writings. His calling shaped his perspective and ministry. It also shows that God is in charge of human history. At a time when things seemed uncertain, God called a man to speak for him. This shows that even when things seem chaotic, there is a divine purpose at work. For modern readers, Isaiah's story offers insights into leadership, integrity, and moral courage. Isaiah's story challenges us to speak the truth and advocate for justice. It also raises questions about religious experience. How do we balance tradition with new revelations? How do we discern between authentic experiences and illusions? Isaiah's calling reminds us of the importance of humility and dependence on God. Even after his extraordinary experience, Isaiah remained aware of his limitations and the ongoing need for divine grace. This attitude of humility and conviction characterized his entire prophetic ministry. Isaiah's calling invites us to reflect on our own spiritual journeys. What vision could inspire us to serve more dedicatedly? How can we be more sensitive to the divine in our lives? Isaiah's example challenges us to be open to encounters with the divine and to respond with courage when we are called. The book of Isaiah contains some of the most important and detailed prophecies in the Old Testament. They have shaped Jewish expectations for centuries and been studied intensively by scholars. Isaiah 7 verse 14 is a famous messianic prophecy. "The Lord will give you a sign, the virgin will have a son and name him Emmanuel." Christians believe this is a prediction of Jesus' birth. Emmanuel means, God is with us. The prophecy of the promised Messiah is important because it was made at a specific time. It was made by Isaiah during the time of King Ahaz of Judah. The prophecy was about the future and was very important to people at that time. Another notable messianic prophecy is found in chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. A child is born, a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His government and peace will last forever. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and sustaining it with justice and righteousness. This passage describes an ideal ruler. This ideal ruler has qualities that go beyond those of an ordinary human king. The titles given to this ruler suggest a leader who would combine wisdom, divine power, paternal care, and the ability to establish lasting peace. Many interpreters believe these qualities point to a figure who is more than a mere human king, a divine Messiah. In chapter 11, Isaiah describes the Messiah as a new beginning for the Davidic lineage. The Messiah is filled with the Spirit of the Lord and possesses wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, knowledge, and fear of the Lord. Isaiah says the Messiah will judge with justice and equity. He will not judge by appearances or make decisions based solely on what he hears. He will judge the needy with justice and make right decisions on behalf of the poor. This emphasis on social justice and protection of the vulnerable is a recurring theme in Isaiah's prophecies. Chapter 53 of Isaiah contains one of the most well-known and debated messianic prophecies. Isaiah describes a suffering servant who bears the pains and transgressions of many. This figure is despised and rejected, familiar with suffering, and brings healing and redemption to others. The description of the servant is detailed and moving. He was pierced and crushed for our transgressions and iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Many Christians believe this passage is about Jesus' death. But different religions have different ideas about these prophecies. Christians usually think these passages are about Jesus. Jews often think they are about the people of Israel. Isaiah's messianic prophecies also include visions of an ideal future. In chapter 2, for example, Isaiah describes a time when all nations will come to Jerusalem to learn the ways of God. He envisions a time of universal peace where nations will not take up sword against nation. People have long been inspired by the idea of a peaceful world without conflict or war. Many believe this vision calls for a more peaceful and just world. Another notable messianic prophecy is found in chapter 35, where Isaiah describes a radical transformation of nature. He speaks of deserts blooming and the blind regaining. The blind will see, the deaf will hear, and the lame will leap. This suggests a complete restoration of humanity and all creation. Isaiah's prophecies are remarkable for their content and influence. They shaped Jewish expectations and played a role in early Christian Christology. The New Testament often quotes or alludes to these prophecies. Isaiah's prophecies about Jesus Christ continue to inspire readers today. They ask important questions about hope, redemption, and the role of divine leadership in human history. These prophecies present a powerful vision of a transformed future and an ideal leader who brings justice, peace, and healing. They also make us think about what we want for the future. What kind of leader and what kind of world do we want? How can we make the vision of peace and justice that Isaiah describes a reality? As we continue to explore Isaiah's prophecies, we see how they are connected to themes of judgment and redemption. This interconnection between Isaiah's messages of judgment and hope are intertwined. His prophecies warn of consequences for disobedience but also offer hope for redemption. This reflects the complexity of the relationship between God and his people. Isaiah is not afraid to denounce sin and its consequences. Isaiah warns of the consequences of sin and offers visions of a restored future. Judgment is a prominent theme in the early chapters. Isaiah accuses Judah and Jerusalem of sin, iniquity, and turning away from the Lord. Isaiah uses strong language to warn people about sin. He criticizes idolatry, social injustice, political corruption, and religious hypocrisy. He also condemns those who call evil good and good evil. The prophet also denounces the oppression of the poor and vulnerable, which is a recurring concern in his messages. Isaiah's warnings are not limited to Judah and Israel alone. He also prophesies judgments against various neighboring nations, including Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, and others. These prophecies against the nations found in chapters 13 and 23 demonstrate God's sovereignty over all peoples. No nation is beyond God's judgment. Isaiah's messages of judgment are often conditional. Judgment may result from persistent sin, but repentance and restoration are possible. In chapter 1, after a series of accusations, God invites the people to reason together. Though sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. This offer of forgiveness and purification is a common theme in the book. It shows that God's purpose is not destruction but restoration. The promises of redemption in Isaiah are some of the most beautiful. They are some of the most inspiring in the Bible. They encompass many themes, including national restoration, personal healing, spiritual transformation, and cosmic renewal. One of the most memorable promises is found in chapter 2, where Isaiah describes a future in which all nations will flow to Jerusalem to learn the ways of God. This vision of universal peace and harmony stands in stark contrast to the realities of conflict and division that Isaiah observed in his own time. Is another powerful promise of redemption. In chapter 35, Isaiah paints a vivid picture of restoration. The desert and the dry land shall be glad. The wilderness shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame leap like a deer and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. Isaiah's promises suggest a complete transformation. Isaiah often links his promises of redemption with his prophecies about the Messiah. The Messiah will bring justice, peace, and healing. In chapter 61, the Messiah says that the Lord has sent him to proclaim good news to the poor, bind up the brokenhearted, and set the captives free. The promises of redemption are cosmic. The prophet's vision is not just about Israel or humanity. It is about all of creation. In chapter 65, Isaiah speaks of new heavens and a new earth. This vision of total renewal was later echoed in the book of Revelation. Isaiah's prophecies show a deep understanding of God and the divine-human relationship. God is portrayed as just and holy. Isaiah's messages show that God is both just and loving. He is always willing to forgive, but he also shows the consequences of sin. This duality motivates people to repent and trust in God's mercy. It also provides comfort in times of affliction. For modern readers, the messages of judgment and redemption in Isaiah remain relevant. Isaiah's messages of judgment and redemption are still relevant. They challenge us to examine our lives and societies in light of God's standards of justice and righteousness. They also offer hope that redemption and renewal are always possible. Isaiah's prophecies invite us to reflect on justice and mercy. How can we seek justice without losing sight of mercy? Forgiveness and reconciliation. How can we maintain hope in times of adversity? Trusting in God's promises of redemption. Moreover, Isaiah's visions of a transformed future challenge us to work for justice and peace in our own time. While we may not be able to fully realize these promises, we can still strive to incorporate their principles into our lives and communities. As we continue our exploration of Isaiah's prophecies, we see how the themes of judgment and redemption intertwine. His messages are connected to other topics, including visions of the future. This leads us to the next topic, the suffering servant. This is one of the most impactful and debated prophecies in the book of Isaiah. The description of the suffering servant is one of the most profound and impactful. This enigmatic figure is presented in the Songs of the Servant. The Songs of the Servant in Isaiah 42, 49, 50, and 52, 53 have been studied and debated for centuries. The servant is chosen by God for a special mission, but is rejected. The servant is described in detail in chapter 53. This is often called the fourth song of the servant. It is a powerful story of suffering and redemption. The chapter begins with a description of the servant. He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of he had no beauty or majesty. He was unappealing. This contrasts with traditional expectations of a powerful leader or a glorious Messiah. The servant was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. 53 This prophecy says that the servant's suffering has a redemptive purpose. It says that the punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. The servant suffered for others. This shows us that the servant's role was to suffer for us. The prophecy also shows us that the servant did not complain about his suffering. He was led to his death like a lamb or a sheep. He did not complain. This image of accepting suffering is inspiring. Many people have debated how to understand this prophecy. In the Christian tradition, the suffering servant is often identified with Jesus Christ. Many Christians see this passage as a detailed foreshadowing of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. The New Testament often mentions this passage when describing Jesus' death on the cross. In Judaism, interpretations of the suffering servant have varied over time. Some view the servant as a collective figure representing the entire people of Israel. Others have identified him with specific. People have interpreted the prophecy of the suffering servant in different ways. Regardless of the interpretation, the prophecy raises questions about suffering, sacrifice, and the role of the individual in collective redemption. It challenges simplistic notions of reward and punishment. This prophecy presents a more complex view of suffering, where it can have redemptive purposes. The servant is initially despised and rejected, but ultimately exalted. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong. This reversal suggests that true greatness may come through suffering. For modern readers, the prophecy of the suffering servant invites us to reconsider our attitudes towards suffering and sacrifice. The figure of the servant shows us that there is power in humility and in the willingness to suffer for others. The prophecy also raises important questions about justice and forgiveness. How can we reconcile the idea of a just God with the notion of vicarious suffering? How can the sacrifice of one bring healing to many? These are questions that continue to challenge and inspire religious and ethical thinkers. Furthermore, the figure of the suffering servant invites us to reflect on our own willingness to serve and sacrifice for the good of others. To what extent are we willing to embrace discomfort, rejection, or even suffering for a greater cause? How can we incorporate the spirit of selfless service into our own lives and communities? The prophecy of the suffering servant does not glorify suffering for its own sake. It presents a vision where suffering, when embraced voluntarily out of love for others, can have transformative and redemptive power. This is a message that resonates deeply in many spiritual and philosophical traditions around the world. The prophecy of the suffering servant reminds us to look beyond appearances. It challenges us to recognize greatness in humility and selfless service. It connects with the broader themes of the book of Isaiah, intertwining messages of judgment and redemption. It offers a vision of restoration through sacrifice and contrasts with conventional expectations of leadership. The prophecy of the suffering servant adds a profound and moving dimension to the prophet's message. This vision of sacrificial service and redemption through suffering leads us to the next topic of our discussion, the universal. God's sovereignty. Proclaimed in the prophecies of Isaiah. Isaiah's prophecies often talk about God's universal sovereignty. Isaiah presents a vision of God that transcends national and ethnic boundaries. God rules over all nations and all people. In a world where each nation had its own local deities, the assertion of a God who rules over all nations was bold and revolutionary. Isaiah repeatedly proclaims that the God of Israel is the God. Of one of the most powerful expressions of this universal sovereignty is found in chapter 40. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand or marked off the heavens? This poetic language shows that God created and sustains the whole universe, not just one nation. Isaiah also says that God controls human history. He presents God as the one who raises up and brings down nations. God even uses pagan empires to achieve his purpose. In chapter 10, God describes Assyria as his instrument of judgment against Israel. Isaiah also warns that Assyria will face judgment for its arrogance and cruelty. This view of divine sovereignty over the nations is particularly evident in the chapter 13, verse 23. In these chapters, Isaiah prophesies judgments against various neighboring nations, including Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, and others. These prophecies show that no nation is beyond God's reach. Isaiah's prophecies also relate God's sovereignty to human freedom. While God is presented as sovereign over all events, Isaiah also emphasizes human responsibility. They are called to repent and obey, suggesting that their choices have real consequences within God's plan. God's sovereignty in Isaiah's prophecies is not just about power, but also about purpose. Isaiah presents a vision of God working through history to accomplish his plans. In chapter 45, God declares, "I form the light and create darkness, I bring prosperity and create disaster, I do all these things." This shows that even bad things are part of God's plan. Isaiah often says that God knows what will happen in the future. This ability to foresee and shape the future is proof of true divinity. God's universal sovereignty in Isaiah also has implications for salvation. While Isaiah often focuses on Israel as God's chosen people, Isaiah presents a vision of salvation that extends to all nations. In chapter 2, he describes a future where many peoples will come to the mountain of the Lord to learn his ways. This vision reaches its peak in chapter 56, where God declares, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." This shows that God wants everyone in his kingdom. For us today, Isaiah's idea that God is in charge of everything is important. It makes us feel safe when we are unsure. Second, Isaiah's vision challenges narrow nationalism or religious exclusivism. If God is sovereign over all nations, then all people are equally objects of his care and potential recipients of his grace. Third, God's sovereignty encourages us to view global events from a broader perspective. Even when things seem chaotic or unjust, we can trust that God is working to accomplish his greater purposes. Isaiah's vision also raises challenging questions. How do we reconcile God's sovereignty with the evil and suffering in the world? How do we balance divine sovereignty with human responsibility? These are questions that have been debated for centuries. Isaiah's prophecies continue to be a source for such reflection. God's universal sovereignty has implications for our understanding of justice and ethics. If God is sovereign over all nations, then all nations are accountable to his standards of justice. All nations are accountable to God's standards of justice. This challenges us to think globally about social justice, human rights, and care for creation. Isaiah's vision of God's sovereignty invites us to a more humble perspective on our place in the universe. Our struggles and achievements in perspective, inspiring us to trust in God and seek His will. As we explore Isaiah's prophecies, we see how God's universal sovereignty intertwines with other themes, including judgment, redemption, and the messianic promise. Isaiah's vision of a new creation shows us what God's governance over all creation will look like. It will be a renewed and transformed world, where God's sovereignty is fully manifested. All of creation is transformed and renewed. This vision of a glorious future is a climax for many of the themes in the book. It offers hope and comfort amidst messages of judgment and challenge. The vision of the new creation in Isaiah is most explicitly expressed in the final chapters, particularly in chapters 65 and 66. In chapter 65, verse 17, God says, "I am creating new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered." This shows that the world will be completely transformed. The idea of new heavens and a new earth does not mean that the current world will be destroyed. It means that it will be renewed and transformed. Isaiah's vision is of a world where sin and the curse are reversed. The new creation is described as a place without weeping or distress. People will live a long time, and the young will be considered old. People will live in houses and eat fruit from vineyards. 65:21 One of the most memorable images of the new creation in Isaiah is the transformation of nature. 6. This vision of harmony and nature where predators and prey coexist peacefully symbolizes the complete restoration of the original order of creation. The new creation in Isaiah is not only a physical transformation but also a moral and spiritual one. The prophet speaks of a time when the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. 11:9 This image suggests a transformation of human consciousness. Everyone will know and worship God. Isaiah also talks about a fair ruler who will help the poor. This is very different from the way things are now. The new creation in Isaiah also has a cosmic dimension. In chapter 60, the prophet speaks of a time when the sun and moon will no longer shine. For the Lord will be your light. This image suggests a radical transformation of the earth and the entire cosmos. The new creation is often associated with the end of times. Isaiah presents it as something that is already beginning to manifest. In chapter 43, God declares, "I am doing a new thing. It is already springing forth. Do you not perceive it?" This suggests that the new creation is not merely a future hope, but a reality that is already unfolding in the present. Isaiah's vision of a new creation offers several lessons. First, it gives us hope. Second, it challenges us to live according to the values of that future. If we are destined for a world of peace, justice, and harmony, how can we begin to incorporate those values into our lives and communities now? Isaiah's vision reminds us of the interconnectedness of all creation. The transformation he describes is not limited to human beings but encompasses all of nature. Awareness and a deeper sense of stewardship of creation. The vision of the new creation in Isaiah also raises important questions. How do we balance hope for a transformed future with the responsibility to act in the present? Isaiah's vision challenges us to dream big and believe in the possibility of radical transformation. It reminds us that history has a purpose and direction. We are not trapped in an endless cycle of repetition. We are moving towards a glorious destiny. This perspective can give us a deeper sense of meaning and purpose in our daily lives. Isaiah's prophecies form a tapestry of visions, warnings, and promises that continue to captivate and challenge readers. From Isaiah's dramatic call in the temple to his visions of a new creation, the book takes us on a journey. A journey through the highs and lows of Israel's history, always pointing towards a future of hope and redemption. We explored many themes, Isaiah shows us a God who is both holy and involved in human affairs. He judges sin but always offers hope for restoration. Isaiah's prophecies invite us to look beyond our circumstances and see God's plan for history. They challenge us to live with integrity. Seek justice and trust in God's promises, even in times of adversity. They inspire us with a vision of a future where all creation will be renewed and the glory of God will be fully manifested. May the words of this prophet continue to challenge us to live with hope and purpose.